Part 1. What are ways I or you can manage minor misbehaviors in the classroom? As a quick recap and refresher back to modules 1 and 2, let's first define what punishment actually means in the classroom when we're speaking to behavior. A punisher is a consequence condition, a consequence stimulus that A, decreases the future probability of that behavior, is administered contingently on the production of an inappropriate behavior, and is administered immediately following the inappropriate behavior that you've observed. Similar to reinforcers, those consequence stimuli that we discussed in Module 5, punishers can only be defined as such dependent on their effects on the learner, or in this case the student's behavior, over time. If that behavior over time decreases, we know that that consequence stimulus is in fact functioning as a punisher. Before we delve deeper into a conversation about responses to inappropriate behavior, some quick punishment reminders. First, you must always remember that punishment consequences should be used sparingly. When overused, punishment consequences can begin to become satiated to the learner, effectively not having the same outcome as you hoped they initially would have. Secondly, consistency, not size, is important. A huge takeaway, a big idea from a lot of these modules is that your consistent response to students' behaviors, both inappropriate and appropriate, is paramount. Additionally, punishment consequences should be selected individually. This is a theme that we will carry throughout this module and have discussed in previous modules. The idea of a student's function of their behavior is critical. In this context, what we're talking about is for an individual student or for a group of students, if you can identify what's maintaining that particular behavior, you want to be able to tie it to a functionally appropriate consequence. In other words, as we're talking through different consequence-based strategies to reduce the likelihood of inappropriate behaviors, always check yourself to ensure that that consequence or that punitive strategy is functionally tied to the student's current challenging behavior. In other words, you can ask yourself, will applying this consequence strategy reduce the future likelihood of the student exhibiting this behavior again? Next, please be sure the punisher functions to decrease the future likelihood of the student's challenging behavior, as I just discussed. And finally, logical consequences are often more effective in the classroom. Some considerations for punishment procedures. Be aware that punishment without a positive, proactive, and instructional approach results in increased aggression, vandalism, truancy, and dropouts. Again, underscoring the importance that anytime you're implementing a response to a student's inappropriate behavior in the way of punishment, it is in your best interest to also identify a more positive, proactive, and preventative approach to respond to students' appropriate behaviors when they do occur. You have likely seen this slide in previous modules. This is the Positive Classroom Behavior Support Practices Decision-Making Guide. We have looked at these 3 guiding questions across previous modules. We'll continue to look at this map across today's module. First, we looked to the question, are the foundations of effective positive classroom behavior support practices in place? If the answer to that question is yes, we then moved into a conversation around are proactive and positive practices implemented consistently. In other words, have we implemented positive preventative strategies? Have we implemented them to the level that we want to implement them? And are they effective in their implementation? If the answer to those questions are also yes, the final question here in our decision-making guide is, do data indicate that students are still engaging in problem behaviors? Let's look at this a bit more closely. Are students still engaging in problem behaviors? One of 2 answers here, yes or no. If the answer is no, students are no longer engaging in problem behaviors, you should celebrate that. Well done. At this point, you can monitor the outcomes, student outcomes, and adjust your class-wide behavior management strategies as needed. In all likelihood, you will not be answering no for all of your students' behaviors. You may, for some students, or quite a few students, answer this question with a yes. The next question you can ask yourself is, are behaviors minor or major violations? As a refresher, to distinguish between what is a minor behavior violation and a major violation corresponds to the intensity and the level of that behavior from the student. It is critically important at this point to review what is a minor and a major behavior violation with other adults and implementers in your classroom. It doesn't hurt if there is variability in understanding between minor and major behavior violations to sit down with those teacher partners in your classroom and operationalize, in other words, define what different minor behaviors are in the classroom, as well as what different major behaviors are in the classroom. The reason for that and why that is so important is so that you can ensure that there are consistent adult responses to different student behaviors across each day and week in your classroom. If you answer that question that most behaviors are minor, you would rely on more brief, specific error corrections and other strategies. If you have more major behavior violations happening regularly in your classroom, you might ask yourself, how many students are involved? Is it just a few students, or are most of my students exhibiting challenging, chronic, major behaviors? If it's many students, you're going to want to look to review, adjust, and intensify your class-wide behavior supports. You're going to want to go back and critically reflect personally on those 5 areas of evidence-based classroom management to identify why are most of my students continually presenting high-level challenging behaviors. What area in my practice can I reestablish around the classroom environment to better support most of my learners? In other words, this may be more of a Tier 1 challenge. If you identify that only a few students are exhibiting these major behaviors, you may look to request additional Tier 2 or Tier 3 support for students. We'll be discussing how to intensify behavior supports in Module 8. For now, let's take a longer look at minor behavior violations. What are brief, specific error corrections? So first, let's look at a couple examples, and then we will define what this means for you as a teacher practice. An elementary example. After a student runs from their seat to the classroom door for lunch, the teacher responds, "Please walk with a quiet body and voice to the door instead of running." With this strategy, we're using specific acknowledgement of the student's inappropriate behavior and immediately providing that feedback to the student after we've seen the behavior occur. At the high school level, a student is observed texting in class. The teacher responds, "Please don't text during class. Leave your phone in your locker." Again, hopefully this teacher has responded specifically and immediately following them observing the student texting in class, and they've let the student know what they've observed or what they've witnessed that is inappropriate during that class time. A non-example of using brief specific error correction would be shouting no to the student. This would be a non-example as it would not be a calm definition of response to student inappropriate behavior, is not neutral or specific. In this case, the student will not have learned what they did inappropriately and how they can correct that in the future. Another example, a 5-minute conversation with a student for what the student was thinking. This would not be a brief specific error correction strategy, as it by nature is lengthy, as it is a discussion with the student, and as it has a tendency to just perseverate on what was inappropriate that you observed the student doing without focusing on what the student can do to improve in the future. So when using quick error corrections, you should focus on these 3 critical elements. Error corrections should be contingent. That is, they should occur immediately after the undesired behavior is observed by you. Your feedback should also be specific. You should tell the learner exactly what they are doing incorrectly and what they should do differently in the future to improve their behavior and their efforts. And finally, and this is a critical element of this strategy, you should try to be brief. After redirecting the student back to the appropriate behavior, move on. Do not linger. Do not admire their inappropriate behavior for quite some time. Instead, just move on with your lesson and hopefully circle back to give them some specific contingent praise when you observe them exhibiting more appropriate behaviors. We'll ask you to turn to your activity workbooks now for activity 5.1, which is a stop and jot activity. Here you're going to look to develop a brief error correction. Look to write 3 or more specific brief error correction statements that you will use to correct inappropriate social behavior in your classroom. If you have extra time, consider how you would modify those statements based on students' learning histories, their age, their ability or disability, or a variety of other variables. Welcome back. You likely just completed activity 5.1. In review, double check your brief error corrections. Look to see if they're specific. How did you redirect the student back to the appropriate behavior? Will the student understand what you were asking of them? Finally, how would you modify these based on the individual needs of your learners? If you have time, you can certainly share out your responses with colleagues or your coach as well. Now that you've had some time to draft specific contingent error correction statements that you could see yourself using and implementing on a regular basis in your classroom, we want to also talk briefly about some other variations for how you may manage minor behavior violations in your room. One such strategy that you might see yourself using is something called proximity control. With this strategy, you are strategically placing yourself and moving yourself to students who are having minor behavior challenges. The teacher is a source of protection and strength in this scenario, helping the student to readjust and refocus on the instruction at hand. Another efficient redirective strategy is known as a nonverbal cue. Nonverbal techniques such as sustained eye contact, hand gestures, a hand clap, finger snap, clearing your throat, etc., suggest to the student that you are aware of their inappropriate behavior and that you are watching them. Effectively, you are reprompting them and, again, refocusing them to the instruction at hand. These are known as nonverbal cues. A third efficient strategy or way to respond to inappropriate minor behavior violations in the classroom is you ignoring, attending, and praising to the student as appropriate behavior is manifest. In this scenario, you use the power of praise or positive feedback to reshape the student away from the minor inappropriate violation behavior to a more appropriate replacement or desired behavior. The teacher praises an appropriate behavior student in the proximity of the student who is not following expectations. In this scenario, the praise serves as a prompt to the student who is misbehaving that they should refocus in order to receive that praise from the teacher. In other words, you're using an exemplar student as a model to redirect the student who is misbehaving. Then finally, when your target student exhibits a desired behavior, you are refocusing your appropriate positive attention on that student and praising them with specific contingent praise statements as appropriate and when appropriate behavior is manifested. So effectively you have, in addition to the specific contingent error correction statements that you just practiced writing, 3 additional very efficient strategies to respond to minor behavior violations. Some considerations for error correction. First, you should never overlook minor misbehavior. Don't avoid correcting and teaching behaviors, no matter how minor they appear to be. In doing so, you will have embraced correction as a tool to truly help students learn and improve behavior over time. With this culture in your classroom, correction will be viewed and ideally perceived not as a punitive, but instead as an instructional approach to help support your learners. You should also create an expectation for correction in your classroom and develop an environment where corrective feedback is the norm. Additionally, you should always strive to correct privately. Use preferred adult behaviors that maintain respect for the student. What that means is, instead of calling out and again perseverating on and drawing on about how the student has misbehaved in your classroom in front of all of their peers, it is more effective to pull the student aside into a private setting to give them that specific contingent error correction. Additionally, when the student demonstrates the desired behavior, you should always be ready to provide them with praise or positive feedback. Again, what we're trying to always do is outweigh our positive interactions with our students versus our negative. So if you are providing one of these specific contingent error correction statements or other efficient strategies to respond to minor misbehaviors, you should also be managing your own behavior on the number of positive interactions you have with that student. You should use these strategies and use the strategy that is least intrusive for the behavior, as well as its frequency and severity. So begin with specific contingent verbal responses to students. Consider stacking on some of the other strategies that we've just mentioned. As we move forward through this module, also consider what other consequence-based strategies may be effective depending on what you're observing in your classroom. When inappropriate behaviors do occur, as they will, you should increase your teachings. That means your lessons, your pre-corrects, and your rates of encouragement, your positive feedback to students. Finally, as needed, you may consider pairing your instructional error correction strategies with additional consequences and/or punishments. And those are the strategies we'll be discussing in part 2 of this module. On the screen in front of you now is a quick resource that you will find online. This is an easy and quick way to remember ways to respond to inappropriate minor behaviors as they occur, using the acronym FAST. So the F stands for functional. In other words, why is the student performing the inappropriate behavior in your classroom? If you can identify why they're performing that behavior, you will be more readily able to respond to that behavior appropriately with your error correction statement. The A stands for accurate, as much as possible. An accurate and critical, consistent response is essential to minimize the problem behavior and increase the compliant behavior from your students. Specific, we've already talked about. You can be as specific as possible with your error correction statements. It will only value the student. It will only make your impact on the student's future behavior that much more impactful. And we've also talked about the T, timely. That is, as quickly and contingently following the inappropriate behavior, you're responding with this specific, accurate statement about what you observe them doing inappropriately and what they can and should be doing in the future to curb that inappropriate behavior towards a more desirable behavior. This slide is a refresher slide from our first modules as we spoke about function of behavior. So as a reminder, you likely recall our conversation about function. You should always consider the function of the students appropriate and inappropriate behaviors when determining how you will respond to that behavior. Broadly speaking, we spoke to the function of behavior either being to get or obtain something or to escape, avoid something. If you can confidently conclude that the student is exhibiting a minor misbehavior in order to receive something, either something in the environment, something social, or something tangible, you would call that type of consequence positive reinforcement. If you can conclude that a student's target behavior is being exhibited to escape against something from the environment, something social, adult or peer attention, or something tangible, you can then call that a negative reinforcer. In turn, as you know the function of the student's misbehavior, you will then more appropriately be informed on how you can and should respond to that misbehavior. As such, you may consider a continuum of error correction approaches. Again, each of these approaches may be used in conjunction and stacked upon one another depending on the circumstance. The least intrusive strategy on this continuum is the redirect. This is a brief, clear, and private verbal reminder to the student of your expected behavior. It is a restatement of the school-wide and non-classroom behavior or the classroom procedure that the student has violated. Following up on a redirect, you may be in a situation where you might want to reteach. A reteach scenario builds on the redirect by specifically instructing the student on exactly what should be done at that point in time during the lesson. If the redirect and the reteach scenario and strategy is not effective, you may look and consider providing the student with choices. Choices can be used when a redirect or reteaching have not worked. A statement of 2 or more alternatives can be provided to the student, effectively giving them perceived authority and power over their classroom experience. The preferred or desired behavior or a less preferred choice may be decided upon by the student when presented from you. And finally, a student conference may occur as a strategy. These are often lengthier reteaching or problem-solving scenarios between you and the student. In these meetings, you're discussing the behavior of concern with the student, overtly and explicitly teaching them replacement and or desired behaviors, and discussing with them what they can do in the future to better their efforts during class time. At times, student conferences include role play and or practice. Effectively across this continuum, as previously stated, you should always begin with the least intrusive option, which would be the redirect. If ineffective, you may consider the reteach, the provide choice strategy, and or the student conference to, again, most effectively support your student and explicitly teach them what is expected in your classroom moving forward.